Presidential assassinations are, unfortunately, about as American as apple pie. Some presidents have been the target of not one but multiple assassination attempts, where they survived everything from bullets to bombs and have dodged both deranged individuals as well as elaborate plots. Today, we're taking a look at some of the truly insane ways that U.S. presidents have survived assassinations, starting with the first ever. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln is often assumed to be the first presidential assassination attempt in American history. But 30 years before John Wilkes Booth ruined an audience's theatrical experience, someone else tried to shoot his shot. It was January 30th, 1835, and politicians were attending the funeral of former South Carolina Representative Warren Davis in the Capitol building. Among the mourners was none other than the current president, 67-year-old Andrew Jackson. As Jackson exited the building, a man named Richard Lawrence was waiting there for him. Lawrence pulled a pistol from his jacket, aimed it at Jackson, and fired. Fortunately for Jackson, the gun failed to discharge the bullet. Unfortunately for the would-be assassin, he had made the choice to target a president who had already survived a duel 30 years prior and was not afraid to charge at a man with a gun. As Lawrence produced a second pistol ready to try again, Jackson attempted to beat the man with his cane, shouting, "Let me alone! Let me alone! I know where this came from!" Lawrence managed to fire again, but the gun once again failed to discharge. Jackson was hurried away from the scene and into a carriage, while Navy Lieutenant Thomas Gedney and Tennessee Congressman and frontier legend Davy Crockett took care of Lawrence. So why didn't Lawrence's guns work correctly? Once he was in custody, his weapons were examined, and as far as anyone could tell, Jackson avoided being shot due to sheer dumb luck. It turns out both pistols were functioning properly and had been loaded without any error. In fact, when tried out after the fact, both guns fired perfectly. What were the odds of both guns misfiring back-to-back like that? About 125,000 to 1. The next assassination attempt on our list actually did result in a death, but whether or not the assassin was the one responsible for the killing remains somewhat up for debate. On the morning of July 2, 1881, Charles Guiteau, a failed evangelist, insurance salesman, and a wannabe ambassador to France, approached President Garfield inside the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station in Washington, D.C. While waiting for his train, Garfield was shot twice by Guiteau. The first shot grazed his shoulder, and the second lodged itself just behind his pancreas. But he didn't die right away, nor did he die later that day, or the next, or even a week after. No, Garfield would live on for another 80 days. When he finally succumbed to his injuries and complications from sepsis, debate was sparked across the medical community about who was really responsible for the death. Questions were raised about whether his doctors had done everything they could have to save him. 3 months after Garfield's death, for example, William A. Hammond, a prominent physician who had served as the Surgeon General of the United States Army during the Civil War, criticized the president's doctors for not taking enough preventative measures. Charles Guiteau unsurprisingly agreed with Hammond, saying, "Yes, I shot the president, but his physicians killed him." Guiteau, of course, is not the most trustworthy authority on the subject, but there is still debate to this day about whether Garfield would have survived had his doctors taken more care to not contaminate the wounds. Have you ever heard the phrase, "The pen is mightier than the sword"? Well, how about the speech is mightier than the bullet? On October 14, 1912, Theodore Roosevelt entered his car outside of Gilpatrick Hotel en route to give a speech. He stood up to wave to the crowd gathered there when a shot rang out from a Colt revolver 5 feet away, hitting Roosevelt in the chest. The shooter was quickly stopped and Roosevelt asked to see him. He asked the man why he had done what he did. When the man didn't answer, Roosevelt allowed him to be turned over to the police. Roosevelt reached into his overcoat and felt the bullet hole on the right side of his chest. He refused to go to the hospital, demanding to give his speech instead. There he began with the words, "Friends, I shall ask you to be as quiet as possible. I don't know whether you fully understand that I have just been shot." He opened his vest, exposing his shirt, now stained with blood. But he promised the gasping crowd that he would be fine. It takes more than that to kill a bull moose. And he was right. A later examination revealed that the bullet was lodged against his right rib on an upward path toward his heart. But luckily for Roosevelt, it never reached the vital organ. Its path slowed by his overcoat, the steel-reinforced eyeglass case in his pocket, and the thick pages of the speech stuffed in there with it. Roosevelt ended up surviving the attempt on his life, and it was all thanks to the thick coat and a wordy speech. He would not be the only Roosevelt to experience an assassination attempt, though. It was February 15, 1933, in sunny Miami, Florida, and President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was giving a speech in Bayfront Park. from the back seat of his open touring car. All of a sudden, a man later identified as Giuseppe Zangara shouted, "Too many people are starving," and opened fire on the car. He managed to fire off 6 rounds before he was tackled to the ground by several men from the crowd. The men were about to dispense a bit of mob justice when FDR told them to let the police handle the matter. It was the quick intervention of these bystanders that likely saved FDR's life, and perhaps FDR's intervention in the beating that was about to occur that saved Zangara. So what was Zangara's motive? He later told the authorities, "I don't hate Mr. Roosevelt personally. I hate all officials and anyone who is rich." He also blamed his stomach pain for the act. "Since my stomach hurt, I want to make even with the capitalists by kill the president. My stomach hurt long time." Though FDR survived the attempt, Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak wasn't so lucky. He was hit by a stray bullet, and before being rushed to the hospital, his last words to FDR were, "I'm glad it was me instead of you." Sadly, he wouldn't be as lucky as either of the 2 presidents with the last name Roosevelt, and he ended up dying from his wounds a few weeks later. Sometimes luck saves a president's life, sometimes it's quick thinking on part of their security detail or a random bystander, and sometimes it's just plain old poor planning on the part of the assassins themselves. During the autumn of 1950, President Harry Truman and his family were living in the Blair House on Pennsylvania Avenue, while the White House was being renovated. On the afternoon of November 1st, Truman and his wife suddenly heard gunshots coming from the front steps. 2 men, Griselio Torresola and Oscar Colazzo, had walked up to the front door and opened fire. Secret Service agents stationed at the house acted quickly and stopped the attempt, killing Torresola in the process. But later police interviews with Colazzo exposed the plan was deeply flawed from the beginning. The would-be assassins had done very little prior research, and they hadn't even been certain whether or not Truman would be in the house when they showed up. Truman went on with the rest of his day after the attempt was thwarted, saying a president has to expect these things. Richard Pavlik, a 73-year-old postal worker from New Hampshire, set his sights on Kennedy and put together a plan. He prepared 10 sticks of dynamite, blasting caps, and wire, and began to case the various Kennedy properties. He began in Hyannisport, then moved on to Georgetown, and then to Palm Beach. His precise plan was to attach the explosives to himself, get close to Kennedy, and detonate like a human bomb. However, Pavlik was thwarted by an inability to keep his mouth shut. He mentioned details of his assassination plot in a letter that he wrote, and the Secret Service found out about it. While the Secret Service searched for him, Pavlik made another critical error: reckless driving. He was arrested in Palm Beach for driving on the wrong side of the road, and the police searched his car during the arrest. They found the dynamite that he had brought with him, and Pavlik was locked up before he could see his plan through. As for his motives, he stated, "The Kennedy money bought him the White House. I wanted to teach the United States the presidency is not for sale." This wasn't the only time a president faced threats due to strong opposition. Richard Nixon, another controversial president, had his own share of challenges and scandals. Nixon's presidency is infamously linked with Watergate, a scandal so massive that it created a new suffix used to refer to other scandals. Without Nixon's crimes, there wouldn't be an easy way to indicate that something was controversial by adding a gate onto it. So it comes as no surprise that someone out there might hate him enough to plot against him. But one man took it way too far. Samuel Bike was a failed businessman who struggled with depression after his wife divorced him, and he turned all of his animosity toward Nixon. He first caught the attention of the Secret Service in 1972 for threatening Nixon's life, but in 1974 he graduated from threats to action. On the morning of Friday, February 22, 1974, Bike drove to the Baltimore-Washington International Airport with the intention of hijacking a plane and crashing it into the White House while Nixon was inside. He shot and killed Maryland Aviation Administration officer George Neil Ramsburg, then stormed on to Delta Airlines Flight 523 to Atlanta. He held the pilots, Reese Lofton and Fred Jones, at gunpoint. The men complied but told them that they could not take off with the doors to the plane open. While Bike was closing the doors, the pilots reached out to the control tower and called for help. But when Bike got back, the pilots still refused to take off, and he shot them both. Then, with no one left to fly the plane, he grabbed a random passenger and ordered her to pilot the craft instead. During the resulting police standoff, a police officer fired 4 shots through the door of the aircraft and wounded Bike. But before the police could get inside the plane, Bike was already dead. Bike's assassination plot, which he had nicknamed Operation Pandora's Box, was a failure. But even though Nixon was safe from Bike's homicidal rage, one of the captains was killed during the attempted hijacking. A 1987 document from the Federal Aviation Administration remarked on the event, "Though Bike lacked the skill and self-control to reach his target, he had provided a chilling reminder of the potential of violence against civil aviation. Under a more relaxed security system, his suicidal rampage might have begun when the airliner was aloft. But not all would-be presidential assassinations were random nobodies. Some would have connections to far more dangerous people. President Gerald Ford faced 2 assassinations for the price of one during the month of September 1975, when he survived 2 separate assassination attempts only 17 days apart. The first was on September 5, 1975, while Ford was in Sacramento for a meeting with Governor Jerry Brown. On the way from his hotel room to his meeting, Ford stopped to greet a crowd of admirers. While he was stopped, a young woman in a red dress pulled a gun before she could be stopped by the Secret Service. She attempted to fire the weapon, but the gun jammed, yet another president saved by a lucky break, and she was unable to fire a shot. The woman's name was Lynette Squeaky Fromm, and she was a member of a certain infamous family. You might have heard of them, the Manson family. She was planning to assassinate Ford in an attempt to impress Manson and attract attention, but was thwarted. The next attempt, just over 2 weeks later, saw Ford back in California for an annual convention where he was scheduled to speak. As he left the hotel and was heading toward his limousine, another woman approached him. Her gun worked a lot better than Fromm's, and she managed to fire a shot. However, her aim was about as good as the quality of Fromm's gun, and she missed, hitting the door of the hotel instead. She prepared to fire a second shot, but a bystander by the name of Oliver Sipple intervened. He grabbed her hand, throwing her aim off and causing the bullet to hit a nearby civilian instead. The civilian thankfully survived, and the shooter, Sarah Jane Moore, was arrested. Moore's motive for attempting to assassinate President Gerald Ford was driven by her radical political beliefs and a desire to instigate social change. Moore, who had been involved with various leftist groups and had previously acted as an FBI informant, became increasingly disillusioned with the government and the political system. She believed that by killing President Ford, she could spark a revolution. After her arrest, Moore expressed regret for her actions, stating that she was misguided in her beliefs and understanding of the potential consequences of her actions. It can be a bit of a fool's errand to search for meaning in the motives of attempted assassins, though. Some of them are attempting to advance a political cause, sure, but just as many of them are acting out of petty personal grievances like a failed business or a chronic stomachache. Then there's John Hinckley Jr., the man who shot the president because he hoped it might impress Jodie Foster, the actress famous for Taxi Driver, Silence of the Lambs, and many other iconic films. But first, let's get one thing out of the way. No, it didn't impress her. Now let's talk about the attempt itself. On March 30th, 1981, President Ronald Reagan was leaving the Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. after giving a speech when John Hinckley Jr. fired a .22 caliber pistol at the president and his security team. One of the bullets ricocheted off the limousine, hitting him under the left armpit and injuring him. The press secretary, a Secret Service agent, and a police officer were also injured. In all the chaos, Reagan's injuries were not immediately noticed until he started coughing up blood. He was rushed to the hospital and into surgery. Before he was wheeled into surgery, Reagan cracked a joke to his wife Nancy in an attempt to calm her down. "Honey, I forgot to duck." The doctors removed the bullet, which was lodged only inches from the president's heart. If the bullet had hit in a slightly different spot, or the surgeons had not acted quickly enough, he likely would have been killed. While Reagan's would-be assassin was driven by pure insanity, there was a much more concerted effort to take out his former vice president and successor. 12 years later, on the night of April 13, 1993, authorities in Kuwait arrested 14 people who had hidden explosives in a Toyota Land Cruiser. Their plan? To kill the former president George H.W. Bush when he arrived in the city the following day. Links soon emerged between the explosive used and Iraqi forces, and the attempt motivated U.S. President Bill Clinton, who had won the presidency from Bush the previous year, to authorize missile strikes in Iraq in June that same year. Years later, in 2005, President George W. Bush was targeted with a grenade during a visit to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. No explosion was reported, but the Secret Service treated the incident as an attempt on the president's life. On the night of November 11, 2011, gunshots were heard near the White House. At first, it was uncertain whether the gunshots were related to the White House itself or to President Obama, but then a bullet was discovered between the outer gates and the bulletproof layer of the White House second-floor window. Notably, this part is the area where the first family was living. Luckily, President Obama and the First Lady were not in D.C. at the time of the shooting. The culprit was identified as Oscar Ramiro Ortega Hernandez, who had hit the White House with at least 7 rounds during his shooting. He was arrested 5 days later at a hotel in Pennsylvania. Later, he was determined to have acted out of hatred for Obama, who he believed to be the devil and the Antichrist. Though Obama was not at home at the time, the act was still treated as an assassination attempt, and he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Some would-be assassins prefer to attempt their crimes remotely. Call it working from home. In April 2013, a letter laced with deadly poison ricin was sent to President Obama. Then another attempt was made in June 2013, which was linked to former actress Shannon Richardson. But this would not be the only attempt to harm Obama through the mail. In October 2018, a series of pipe bombs were intercepted by officials. These bombs had been mailed to several leaders within the Democratic Party, including Obama and Hillary Clinton. Some of the targets were not politicians at all, such as, bizarrely, Robert De Niro. No one was actually injured by these pipe bombs, but 16 were mailed in total. The FBI investigation led to Cesar Sayoc, who pled guilty to 65 felony counts and was then sentenced to 20 years in prison. And if you think political violence went out with the Obama administration, recent events would have proven to you that this is incredibly wrong. On July 13, 2024, former President Donald Trump was speaking at a campaign rally in Butler, Pennsylvania, when a shooter opened fire from a nearby rooftop. Trump was struck in the ear, while one person in the crowd was killed and 2 more were injured. Secret Service agents were able to kill the shooter and stop him from firing more shots, as other agents threw themselves in front of Trump as human shields to protect him from any additional fire. If Trump's head had been angled differently during the initial shot, the bullet likely would have done a lot more damage and perhaps even killed him. But because his head turned and the shooter missed, he was struck in the ear instead. The Secret Service were able to take down the shooter before he got a chance to try again, but it could have very easily gone a different way. As we saw in many of the previous assassination attempts, it's often just a bit of luck that makes all the difference. Now go check out Insane Ways the Queen of England Survived 3 Assassination Attempts, or this other video instead.